And welcome again to Cottage Talk. I am Russ Goldman. This is my match reaction, my 5 takeaways from Fulham's victory against Everton, 3-1 on the road at Goodison Park, a very difficult place to play at, and Fulham get all 3 points, well needed, all 3 points. And I'll be sharing my thoughts and my 5 takeaways in this show. As always, please do subscribe on YouTube and Apple Podcasts. It does help other Fulham supporters find us. We will have more match reaction in the coming days, but this is my 5 takeaways. Let's start with number 5. And let's talk about Harry Wilson and Dan James, both starting in this match, and they very much took advantage of their opportunity to start against Everton. Let's just talk about that. I didn't see this coming from Marco Silva. He decided to change the formation. False 9, it looked like. Have Dan James up top, Harry Wilson on the right, and then, of course, you had on the left Willian and Pereira in the middle. Very interesting. It really worked. But the big reason why it worked, I feel, is these two men. Harry Wilson has not played this well in a very long time. He took advantage of this opportunity. He could have scored a few goals here, by the way. Harrison Reed scored the first goal for Fulham, but it was really set up by a wonderful strike from Harry Wilson, who just hit the post, unfortunately for him. And then, of course, he does get his goal, and Dan James gets his goal as well. But what's interesting about both of them is they seized the moment here. Fulham decided to play differently, and they took advantage of this opportunity. And I want to give Marco a lot of credit because I think he played to the strengths of both players. The pace of Dan James terrorizing the center backs of Everton. And then you also have the pace of Harry Wilson, but also the playmaking ability on the right as a winger. He can score goals, but he can also set up his teammates. He was very dangerous. But I want to say this. I think it's the combination of the two of them that really propelled Fulham in this match. There's some very good performances, but we have to start with Harry Wilson and Dan James, in my opinion. I'm happy for both of them. Dan James has come under serious scrutiny because his loan so far from Leeds United has not really worked out. Now he had a true opportunity to play, and he seized the moment. Harry Wilson was great last season, but I think was really struggling from the injury. So he really hadn't had a chance to shine. And in this match against Everton, both shined, and that is the bottom line. That's why number 5 is all about Harry Wilson and Dan James. Number 4, why did Marco wait so long to try this formation? I got a theory on this. In the last few matches, it just wasn't working, but I think truly, and I want to give Marco some credit. Marco, I do believe, does stick by his players. And I think he was just committed to giving Carlos Vinicius every chance that he could to play that Mitro role. And I think in the last match, potentially, I think Marco might have seen that he might not be up to that task. So then you have to say, let's try something different. So I think the last match against West Ham was the breaking point where Marco looked at what happened and changed what he wanted to do in this upcoming match. Will the change continue for matches to come? I don't know. But I'm glad that he decided to make this change. Nothing against Carlos Vinicius, but it just wasn't working for him. So I think good managers don't just stick to what they do. As I always say, when you do what you do, sometimes you get found out. And I think that's what was happening to Fulham. So for me, huge credit to Marco Silva for deciding to make this change. But I really think, for me, I think part of it had to do with the opponent, because I thought that he was probably thinking that the pace of Dan James would terrorize the center backs. He was right about that. But I also think it had something to do with Carlos Vinicius, that he was going to have a hard time playing against these two center backs, that it was basically just going to be a road to nowhere for him. So instead, let's try something else. And let's just say it worked really well. So let's now move to number 3. And number 3 is an interesting one, because what's interesting when you look at this really showed itself in the second half. Fulham used the entire pitch to stretch Everton and run them ragged. It really showed itself in the second half. It showed itself in the beginning of the match, but after McNeil got the goal, Everton really took control for the second half of the first half. But they came out in the second half, and their passing was fantastic. But it wasn't just on one side. They'd be switching the play to the other side. They'd be finding the open man left and right. But the big thing was Everton were chasing shadows. They were running all over the pitch. And let's be honest, they ran out of steam. And that was so nice to see Fulham take advantage of their pace, their ability, maybe their stamina, and run this team ragged. Their possession-based style did in Everton in this match. They ran them out of Goodison Park. They tired them out, and they got the goals they needed to win the match. So for me, number 3 is definitely Fulham used the entire pitch to stretch Everton and run them ragged. Number 2, and I think this is a big one. We'll see what happens moving forward. Here's my question. Has Marco Silva finally found his plan B? I think the answer is yes. Plan B being a false 9. Can you find another way to play without Alexander Mitrovic? I think he discovered it in this match. Can you use it in all the matches moving forward? Well, Dan James will not be able to play against Leeds United. However, you could still use this formation against Leeds United. You just move the pieces of the puzzle around and maybe add a puzzle piece. Maybe you have Harry Wilson playing the Dan James role. Put Bobby Decordova-Reid on the right, which was suggested to me, and Willian on the left, and Pereira as your number 10. Maybe you just move the pieces of the puzzle and add another piece of the puzzle to this formation. I think he's found his plan B. I think you can use this again. You can win without Mitro. We know that. But can you play a little bit differently without Mitro? I think that Marco Silva has 100% found his plan B, and I hope we see this again very soon, and dare I say, against Leeds United. I think this formation, if you put Harry Wilson, maybe even Manor Solomon in that role, I think you could really hurt Leeds United with your pace. It's going to be a possession-based game, but I think you can throw your pace right back at them. Harry Wilson isn't quite at the pace of Dan James, but he's got a lot of pace, and I think he could do some damage against Leeds United. I hope Marco considers this plan B for Leeds United. I'm just going to say that. I think he's found his plan B, which is exciting as a Fulham supporter. Okay, coming up next to end the show, I'm going to share with you my number 1 takeaway from Fulham's massive victory against Everton at Goodison Park. Okay, to end the show, I'm going to share with you my number 1 takeaway. Before I do that, as always, please do subscribe on YouTube and Apple Podcasts. I know I said that at the beginning of the show, but I definitely want people to subscribe on YouTube and Apple Podcasts. My number 1 takeaway is this. What did Marco Silva say at halftime? Because Fulham were a different team in the second half. And this is what's interesting, and I'm just going to throw this out there. Maybe, just maybe, Fulham had a little bit of an advantage with Boa on the touchline and Marco Silva up in the stands or at the press box. I'm not exactly sure where he was, but let's just be honest here. I think you get a different vantage point because Fulham definitely were a different team in the second half. Not sure what he said, but this is where you saw Fulham take advantage of the entire pitch and really stretch them. So was it a motivating talk at halftime? Possibly. Was it strategic? I think so as well. I think it's a combination of both. But what's interesting about this is I find it fascinating that even with Marco, not on the touchline, I think he saw something up in the stands that helped Fulham in this match because in the first half, we saw an adjustment by Sean Dyche. He moved his pieces of the puzzle around, and I think that affected the second half of the first half. He flipped McNeil with another player, and he moved the player more central, and that changed things around a little bit. So I think Marco saw that, said something to the players at halftime, part of it motivating, part of it strategic, and Fulham, they weathered a little bit of a storm in the second half to begin the second half, and then they just took over. They dominated the second half. They should have won by more. That is what's so impressive about this Fulham victory. And what I'm curious what Marco actually said at the end of the first half, going into the second half at halftime. What did he say? Because whatever he said, I think it worked really well. And Fulham really saw a huge difference in the second half. So for me, Marco deserves some credit because I'm sure he said something. The players deserve even more credit for what they did in the second half because they dominated the second half, totally dominated. So, but I have to look at what was potentially said at halftime. So that is why that is my number one takeaway. Okay, well, that's going to do it for this quick episode of Cottage Talk. As I mentioned, we will have another show talking about this match. I look forward to having an additional show where we'll go into more detail about this Fulham victory, but I wanted to do a quick show and give you my 5 takeaways from this massive Fulham victory against Everton. As always, one last time, please do subscribe on YouTube and Apple Podcasts. It does help other Fulham supporters find us. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Cottage Talk. My name is Russ Goldman. Thank you as always for watching and listening to Cottage Talk, now part of the talkSPORT Fan Network.